On the other side, the notion of pure insight is something other to itself than its own object, for it is just this negative determination that constitutes the object. Thus, from the other side, it also declares the essence of faith to be something alien to consciousness, to be not its essence, but a changeling foisted on it. But here enlightenment is foolish. Faith regards it as not knowing what it is saying and as not understanding the real facts when it talks about priestly deception and deluding the people. It talks about this as if by some hocus pocus of conjuring, priests' consciousness had been palmed off with something absolutely alien and other to it in place of its own essence. And at the same time, it says that this is an essence of consciousness, that consciousness believes in it, puts its trust in it, and seeks to make it favorably disposed towards itself. That is, consciousness beholds in it its pure essence just as much as its own single and universal individuality, and through this action produces this unity of itself with its essence. Thus, what it asserts to be alien to consciousness, it directly declares to be the inmost nature of consciousness itself. How then can it possibly talk about deception and delusion, since in the same voice it asserts the very opposite of what it maintains regarding faith? It really reveals itself to faith as the conscious lie. How are delusion and deception to take place where consciousness in its truth has directly the certainty of itself, where in its object it possesses its own self, since it just as much finds as produces itself in it? The distinction no longer exists even in words. If the general question has been propounded whether it is permissible to delude a people, the answer would in fact have to be that the question is pointless, because it is impossible to deceive a people in this manner. Brass instead of gold, counterfeit instead of genuine money may well be passed off in isolated cases. Many may be persuaded to believe that a battle lost was a battle won, and other lies about things of sense and isolated happenings may be made credible for a time. But in the knowledge of that essential being in which consciousness has the immediate certainty of itself, the idea of delusion is quite out of the question. Paragraph 550 is a somewhat long one, and it's very dialectical in a sense that you've got two sides, both of whom are in some sense making demands upon each other. So you could say it's actually not just dialectical, but a particular form of the dialectical that includes something dialogical, where there's a side that is presenting what's going on and its view on everything else, and then the other side that's part of that picture says, well, wait a second, I don't think you've got this quite right. Let's discuss this. Or perhaps in a more hostile way, listen, buddy, you've got it completely wrong. Let me tell you how you've got it wrong. And then it's up to the first side to say, well, am I getting it wrong, or should I double down and say, no, you're the one who's wrong? This is happening in the course of enlightenment between pure insight and faith. And when we think about enlightenment, we're normally thinking about the side that calls itself enlightened. This is one of Hegel's points that he's making throughout this section. The side of faith does have its own counter-responses that aren't just knee-jerk reactions, in part because both pure insight and faith are more than just superstition or as he's saying here, something alien, something foreign to consciousness. They are consciousness. They are the development of consciousness. Faith is not the same thing, as we've talked about before, as the earlier seen unhappy consciousness or the religion of the family. We've got something a bit more, not just sophisticated, but we could say purified here going on. So, Hegel tells us at the beginning of this, the notion of pure insight is something other to itself than its own object, for it's just this negative determination that constitutes the object. What is he doing there? He's recapping what has been going on in the previous discussions, saying that pure insight, is a negative determination. It's when it thinks about its own activity, it's really engaged in negative or critical orientation and analysis of whatever it's finding. It doesn't have a content of its own except that very negativity. So he says, from the other side, it also declares the essence of faith, the essence, what it is that is at the very core of faith, which does have content, to be something alien, something foreign to consciousness, something that can't be assimilated, that is, in a certain sense, if not, supraconscious, subconscious, below the realm of the rational, below the realm of what could be explained. This is a typical criticism of perspectives of faith. And, to be sure, I want to say something here before we go any further. Hegel is not defending every single religious believer or every single instance of faith here. He's perfectly willing to say that the way in which many people in his own time and times past, and he would say this about many religious people in the present, the way in which they're approaching the object of faith or the content, the doctrines, or the rituals is, very, we could say, anti-rational. Right? It's not developing the human being. It's telling the human being to turn their brain off or to privilege the heart over the head or whatever else you want to say. That's not a problem. Because that's not all that religious faith is. As is evidenced by looking around and finding people that don't actually fit the bill for that. Thoughtful believers. Hegel himself would place his own work within that context. So he goes on and he says, it declares the essence of faith to something alien to consciousness, to be not its essence, but a changeling foisted on it. Some sort of thing that it's being asked to take care of, a changeling, or you might say a cuckoo. The cuckoo bird lays its eggs and then pushes, tries to get rid of the other bird's eggs, gets other birds to raise its own young. That's, in a sense, what Enlightenment says that is happening with faith. Faith is doing this to consciousness. Is this really the case? Is this critique on point, we could say? Hegel says here Enlightenment is actually foolish. Now notice right there, this is a very important point. Enlightenment is foolish. We've got a contradiction here. Enlightenment is supposed to be advanced. Enlightenment is supposed to be progressing in terms of consciousness, not regressing into foolishness. So we've got a conflict brewing within Enlightenment itself. Notice here where faith can respond. Faith regards Enlightenment not knowing what it's saying, not understanding the real facts when it talks about priestly deception and deluding the people. And this is a caricature, right? He says it talks about this as if by some hocus pocus of conjuring priests, consciousness had been palmed off with something absolutely alien and other to it in place of its own essence. So consciousness in the form of the ordinary person, the person of good sense, as we might say, has been sold a bill of goods by these deceptive priests. And it could be, Catholic priests, it could be, Protestant ministers, it could be Jewish rabbis, it could be whoever you like within Western consciousness, or, it could be all over the world. Faith can say, you don't actually know what you're talking about. I mean, here's one thing that Hegel doesn't talk about that I think is really worth remembering. When you're criticizing religious institutions, but you're relying on stereotypes that may have some substance at some point in time, but you're globalizing from that, actual religious believers can say, wow, buddy, you don't realize how bad it actually is. I mean, you talk about this sort of stuff happening in the monasteries, but I'm a monk, and I can tell you that that's just, the tip of the iceberg. As a matter of fact, you don't actually know what the bad stuff is. It's more like the mutual feuds between us monks, or trying to deal with the fact that this guy gets drunk all the time, or, on and on and on and on. And we can, so there's that aspect. You can say, wow, your criticism, it would be on point with a few individuals, but the real problem is over here. That's one thing. And that's coming from experience. And presumably, Enlightenment would be interested in actually being, as we call it, evidence-based, right? There's a lot of, you might say, lip service given to this that quickly degenerates into an ideology that just turns against, people that belong to a religion or another religion. We can also say that in a lot of cases, the criticisms turn out to be off base. As a matter of fact, there's an entire literature out there, a fictional literature, but based in people's experiences of like assuming that this guy is a priest, so he's going to be towing the party line and he's going to be, telling me this and this and this and this. And when you're doing that sort of thing, you're stereotyping the other. You're telling them how they're going to be. Chesterton's Father Brown story is a perfect example of this. Father Brown is constantly surprising the people who are like, you're supposed to be a parish priest and you're supposed to think this, this, and this. And he'll say, well, yes, but I don't think that. And by the way, here's the solution to the puzzle that you were attempting to find. And here's why you didn't get it, because of your own prejudices. So that's what Hegel's talking about here, is prejudices. And that's what Enlightenment is supposed to be attacking, getting rid of, right? But it's placing that onto the people of faith. So he says, going back to this, it's saying that consciousness is getting tricked by the priests. And something alien, something other to consciousness is being placed above it, and it's being told, worship this, listen to this, shut up, don't think, just do what we tell you to. Where's the conflict there? He says, at the same time, it says that this is an essence of consciousness. So the believer is conscious. The believer is human consciousness. That consciousness believes in, puts its trust in, and seeks to make favorably disposed towards it. That is, he says, consciousness beholds in it its pure essence just as much as its own single and universal individuality, and through this action produces this unity of itself with its essence. What is he talking about here? The interaction between the ordinary people, the religious believers, and the absolute, or divine, the object. The individuals and the essence. And the priests are in a weird kind of state, right? They're not the religious object. They're actually somewhat here in the class of the ordinary people. They just happen to be stuck doing the services and running the show and making sure that the church doesn't fall down and all of that sort of stuff, while they've got these Enlightenment philosophers or cultural critics saying, oh, you're a bunch of deceivers. You're just in it to trick people and get power, right? So he goes on and he says, what insight is declaring to be alien to consciousness, it is directly declaring to be the inmost nature of consciousness itself. So it's not really alien. That was a failure on the part of insight to be insightful enough. It didn't engage sufficiently with the realm of faith to know what faith was actually talking about. This is an interesting side note, but anybody who says that Hegel simply attempts to rationalize faith probably ought to look at this portion of the text. This is not the ending, of course, but some of the polemics that we see levied against Hegel maybe don't have as much substance as we might think. Polemics from religious people. So he says, well then how can Enlightenment talk about deception and delusion? In the same voice, it's asserting the very opposite of what it maintains regarding faith, and that means that it reveals itself to faith as the conscious lie. Enlightenment itself is engaging, or insight itself is engaging in a lie. He says, how are delusion and deception to take place where consciousness in its truth has directly the certainty of itself? Now here he's talking about how can everybody be in the dark? How can everybody be deceived? You can't have it both ways. Either people are responding to the object of faith and orienting themselves to it because they're finding something valuable there for themselves, something for consciousness, the essence of consciousness, or it's all BS. And these priests have just been foisting off some stuff on us. But then how did that catch on in the first place? And Hegel says something really interesting here. He says, is it permissible to delude a people? This is a prize essay, right? He says the answer would have to be, in fact, that this is a non-question. This is a pointless question. You can't deceive an entire people. At least not completely, right? Not in every single respect. They are deceived to some degree. He says brass instead of gold, counterfeit instead of genuine money may be passed off in isolated cases. Many may be persuaded to believe a battle lost is a battle won. Other lies about things of sense and isolated happenings may be made credible for a time. But in the knowledge of that essential being in which consciousness has the immediate certainty of itself, the idea of delusion, he says, is quite out of the question. This is a bit of a challenge here, isn't it? Because when you read that, you're like, well, what about the development of the history of religions, right? Don't we say that maybe people were deluded at one point and they got a better idea? Is this compatible with what Hegel's talking about? Aren't there plenty of religious people who are confused even about what their religion is teaching? Aren't there many priests, ministers, whoever else we want to talk about who get confused, who are deluded, who do in fact engage in deception? And Hegel says, yes, that's true. Isolated cases, however, not simply the norm across the board, as Enlightenment, represented in pure insight, is claiming to be the case. Let us see further how faith experiences the enlightenment in the different moments of its own consciousness, to which the view mentioned above referred to only generally. These moments are pure thought, or as object absolute being in and for itself, then its relation as a knowing to absolute being, the ground of its belief, and lastly its relation to absolute being in its acts or its worship and service. Just as pure insight has failed to recognize itself and has denied itself in belief generally, so too in these moments it will behave in an equally perverse manner. Paragraph 551 is very short, and I think the way it's framed, it could be a little bit obscure to the reader as to what exactly Hegel is talking about. I think that this notion of three main moments of consciousness, that we've already talked about quite a bit, and I think that'll be familiar to those who've already gone through the paragraphs in this section. Remember that both faith and insight have these three moments. But you notice now at this point, one of the moments before had been its relation to its other, meaning, faith in relation to insight, insight in relation to faith, and now we've got something different as the third moment here. So it looks, when we give it a first read, he says, let us see how faith experiences the enlightenment in the different moments of its own consciousness, to which the view mentioned above are referred to only general, right? And then he says, we've got these three moments. So these are the ways that faith itself is making sense of its experience. But how are these experiences of the Enlightenment? So we got to dig a little bit deeper in order to talk about this. These are the things that insight is going to be looking at and saying, well, this is what it is for faith, and I, insight, understand that better than faith does in this way. So insight is going to be looking at pure thought or absolute being in and for itself as it is for faith. Insight is going to be looking at faith's relation of knowing to absolute being and saying, well, you don't really have any knowledge at all. Insight is going to be looking at the relation of acts of worship and service to absolute being, and also saying these are blasphemous, these are sacrilegious, these are, superstitious, these are not good. That's what Hegel is actually talking about here. So he tells us what these three are, right? Pure thought, relation as knowing, and relation to absolute being and acts. And he says, just as pure insight failed to recognize itself and denied itself in belief generally, so too in these moments, it will behave in an equally perverse manner. Now, what the question there is, well, what is this it? Are we talking about pure insight behaving in a perverse manner? Or are we talking about the thing that we began this paragraph with, talking about faith? Is faith behaving in an equally perverse manner so that there's kind of a mirroring of what's going on with insight? The answer is this. Insight is depicting to itself faith as acting in an equally perverse manner, and that is how insight is actually getting faith wrong. So this is a very important realization when we think about where we're going in the next paragraphs. Pure insight adopts a negative attitude to the absolute being of the believing consciousness. This being is pure thought, and pure thought posited within itself as an object or as an essence. And in the believing consciousness, this intrinsic being of thought acquires at the same time for consciousness that is for itself the form, but only the empty form, of objectivity. It has the character of something presented to consciousness. To pure insight, however, since it is pure consciousness from the side of the self that is for itself, the other appears as something negative of self-consciousness. This could still be taken either as the pure intrinsic being of thought or also as the being of sense certainty. But since it is at the same time for the self, and this self qua self that has an object is an actual consciousness, the object proper as such is for pure insight an ordinary thing of sense certainty that merely is. This its object is manifest to it in the picture thought of faith. It condemns this picture thought, and in its own object. But in apprehending the object of faith as insight's own object, it already does faith a wrong. For it is saying that the absolute being of faith is a piece of stone, a block of wood, which has eyes and sees not. Or again, a piece of dough, which having come from the field is transformed by man and returned into earth again. Or in whatever other ways faith anthropomorphizes absolute being, making it into an object that it can represent to itself. In paragraph 552, we're looking at one of the main ways in which pure insight manages, in its critical analysis of faith, to mistake what faith is actually up to get faith wrong, and thereby to attribute to faith a sort of consciousness, a naive consciousness that it doesn't really have, which means that, in a certain sense, pure insight itself shows itself as being more naive than the naive consciousness that it is criticizing. And it's going to, as Hegel says, adopt a negative attitude or negate the absolute being of faith, saying that this cannot possibly be the absolute being for consciousness. Faith is getting this wrong. So this is that first moment of what we were talking about in the previous paragraph, right? The moments of faith as consciousness, pure thought or as object, absolute being as it is in for itself. So, what is the being for faith? Well, faith is a mode of thinking. So, as Hegel says, this being, this absolute being, is in fact pure thought. Pure thought posited within itself as an object or as an essence. In the believing consciousness, this intrinsic being, this being in itself, an sich, of thought, acquires at the same time for consciousness, that is, for itself, the form, but only the empty form of objectivity, as the character of something presented to consciousness. And so there is a kind of alienation going on here that we've already seen, right? That's not being debated, right? There is, in fact, an alienation of consciousness, where pure consciousness, the individual consciousness, and the question is, what does this correspond to? Is this just an ideal that has no reality whatsoever projected out there into a kind of void? Well, if it is, then enlightenment and pure insight is actually getting faith wrong in focusing on the picture thinking aspect of it. So let's turn to that. So he says, to pure insight, because pure insight is pure consciousness from the side of the self that is for itself, that understands itself, that that attempts to take a critical attitude on itself and on the rest of the world and on other consciousnesses. The other appears as something negative of self-consciousness. So, you get attitudes of, well, if that's what you mean by God, then God ends up negating the rest of us, so we must negate God. And you could think of, writers like, for example, Jean-Paul Sartre in the 20th century who say things like this, or much more crude, atheist crusaders, let's call them, who similarly misrepresent what it is that religious believers actually do in fact think, or at least some religious believers, the ones who are more rational and less superstitious. So he says, what could this negative of self-consciousness be? He says this could be taken as the pure intrinsic being of thought or as the being of sense certainty. And now we have an interesting transition. You remember the sense certainty was the realm of the senses, right? It's where we began the entire phenomenology after we got through the introduction and before that the preface. So Hegel here is talking about the crudest form of self-consciousness, of consciousness. We're not even at self-consciousness at that part of the work, right? And he's saying this is what Enlightenment thinks that the religious believer is doing. And if you think about, some of the works that are out there, like just read Hume's Natural History of Religion or Hobbes's remarks on religion in Leviathan, you'll see where this comes from. Some of Rousseau's ideas as well. So he says we're looking at sense certainty, and then he says since it is at the same time for the self, and the self as self that has an object is an actual consciousness. The object proper as such for pure insight becomes an ordinary thing of sense certainty. So when pure insight looks at religious believers, at religious comportment, at religious rituals, at institutions, what it sees are the things of sense certainty. It doesn't see them as the religious believer sees them, because it doesn't think there's really anything there beyond that, this stuff up here, absolute being, for the religious believer to be seeing in those physical manifestations, in those sensuous, let's call them images. Here Hegel's talking about picture thinking, but we could just as well say images, right? Why is pure insight wrong about this? Well, when you actually do go and talk to religious believers about the physical apparatus of their place of worship or, their texts or the rituals that they're engaging in or other things, they will say that those things of the world do in fact matter. But does the religious believer in the temple really believe that the God just is the statue? I mean, some religious believers do. But most say, no, the statue is a symbol of something. We don't actually worship the statue. We're worshiping that which the statue represents. Or even not even worshiping it, but venerating it, saying this is part of a religious community. There's a lot of different wrinkles involved here, right? When you're consuming this or that, in a religious ritual, are you actually consuming the God, him or herself, or is there something else going on there? So Hegel says that, going back to pure insight, the object for it as such is an ordinary thing of sense certainty that merely is, just has being. Its object is manifest to it in the picture thought of faith. It says, listen, you faith people, you're kind of dumb. You're relying on pictures rather than concepts. What it is that you're using to conceptualize conceptualize absolute being is not really a conceptualization. It's merely making some nice pictures or images or however you want to frame it. So if that were in fact the case, pure insight would be right in, as Hegel says, condemning this picture thinking. Now notice what he says here. In apprehending the object of faith as insight's own object, it already does faith the wrong. And this is important because pure insight is supposed to be getting things right. That's what allows it to take its critical attitude. So if its critical attitude is another way of getting things wrong, we're posed here with a real problem. Maybe nobody's getting things right. That would be a real kick in the pants for pure insight. Not so much for faith. Faith has an object. Pure insight needs an object, and it needs to get that object right. So, how does it do faith a wrong? Hegel says, it is saying that the absolute being of faith, not absolute being as such, but the absolute being for faith is a piece of stone, a block of wood, which has eyes and sees not. Or again, a piece of dough, which having come from the field is transformed by man and returned by earth again. Or, look at how Hegel leaves this open, in whatever other ways faith anthropomorphizes absolute being, making it to an object that it can represent to itself. So any religious objects, any religious sensuous things are inadequate to represent absolute being, but faith doesn't say that they actually do adequately represent absolute being, and it's a misattribution on the part of insight to say that faith does. Now, can you find some people who are within religious communities or are religious believers who do say boneheaded things, not actually understanding very often their own religious community's teachings on these matters? Oh, absolutely, right? So we do find cases where a person, looks at an icon and thinks that icon is itself Jesus, or go on and on with other examples. But that's not the totality of faith. Certainly not faith in the Enlightenment when faith is itself under a microscope and being critiqued. So this is a very important getting things wrong. Notice what Hegel is doing here. This is the last thing I'll say. He is engaging in critique of those engaging in critique. Is he doing so to take the side of faith? He is not. He's casting himself as being somewhat outside of the conflict and looking in on both sides of the conflict and finding out where they're off base.